Hey guys, Dr. Snellgrove here, just recording a quick video for our first poetry section here in ENC 1102. Now, for better or for worse, poetry is a bit different than how we did in the fiction section. Obviously, with fiction, you're covering one thing at a time, like one short story at a time. And then the poetry unit, the reason I have it in the syllabus, like I didn't want to just list every single poem every single time, so it'll just say stuff like, hey, here, for instance, our section is speaker. Whose voice do we hear? I'll have that in the syllabus, and then it's like, hey, please read the poems in this section. It doesn't take too long. And so what I want to do in these videos, I'm not necessarily going to get to every single one of them necessarily, but I did want to do kind of an overview of each of these poems, talk a little bit about it. Well, most of the poems, at least, so I can keep an eye on my own clock here. And by any chance, if I ever, don't cover a poem that you definitely want to write about, just reach out to me. We can do a one-on-one talk about it. I can send you some special notes, really just whatever works for you. All right. So the first poem in this unit is Hard Rock returns to prison from the hospital for the criminal insane. And this is such a weird little one. I always take a perverse pleasure in starting our poetry unit with this because I had a face-to-face student make this kind of observation today that a lot of it, she said, it almost feels more like it's a short story, than it is a poem. And it's like, well, it's definitely telling you a story, but this is also a good example of like, hey, the poem doesn't necessarily have to rhyme. It doesn't have to have a certain meter necessarily. And a lot of times you go, those are the only kinds of poems you're reading in like middle school or high school. So it can be an eye opener like, oh, I didn't know poems could look like this, could sound like this. All right. So what is going on in this poem? So the titular Hard Rock is basically a badass, a hard ass here in this prison system. So you get stuff about his reputation. He was known not to take no shit from nobody. There's stories in here of him like wrestling the guards. Like they use this term screw, which is referring to like guards here at the prison. A time it took like 8 screws to hold Hard Rock down. There's another time that he like hit the captain with a tray of food. So he's this big, badass. Sure, he's in prison, but he's making it very clear, nobody can exactly control him. And so the story starts out, and I'm doing it, the poem starts out. It's talking about the doctors bored a hole in his head, cut out part of his brain, shot electricity through the rest. So this fella kind of got the 1-2 punch here, a little bit of lobotomy, a little bit of electrotherapy here, shock therapy. And so he is a different man, and arguably not for the better, because the third person narrator, he's a fellow prisoner. He wants to see what happened to Hard Rock. And now it's become, they said that the test came to see if Hard Rock was really tame. So a hillbilly called him a black son of a bitch and didn't lose his teeth. A screw who knew Hard Rock from before shook him down and barked in his face. Hard Rock did nothing, just grinned and looked silly, his eyes empty like knot holes in a fence. So there's obviously something tragic. I mean, there's the like, wow, y'all lobotomized and zapped the brain, of a person at your mercy, which is already pretty screwed, right? But you get this almost mournful quality here at the end, where it's like they realize, oh yeah, Hard Rock, it's going to take them like 3 minutes just to tell you his name. And it says that everyone felt crushed. He had been our destroyer, the doer of things we dreamed of doing, but could not bring ourselves to do. The fears of years, like a biting whip, had cut deep, bloody grooves across our backs. So I was talking about it with the face-to-face class today, that it's that last, really the last 3 lines kind of recontextualizes so much of the poem, because I was doing the normal in class, like little discussion prompt things. I mentioned, what do you think about the racial element, of this poem? And one student raised her hand, like, well, does there have to be a racial element? I was like, well, I'm not telling you what to believe or what to get out of the poem, but, in addition to, he's a Black prisoner, he's mistreated by, presumably largely white, guard population. But there's this end here. The fears of years like a biting whip had cut deep, bloody grooves across our back. So it's pretty much impossible to read that line and not think about like slaves getting whipped. And so it suddenly like recontextualizes the whole poem, where this isn't just the story of hard rock and the people around him, but this is also the story of like racism. This is the story of prison being essentially the new slavery. So the poem doesn't get this didactic, but it is kind of an eye-opener when you look at like the disproportionate number of Black people that are stopped by cops, that are, spend time in jail, how much time they do versus, someone else, that was charged with the same crime, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there is the deeply uncomfortable, at least I think, idea of prison labor. I was joking about it with the class that there's always some, politician or celebrity like, and it'll come out, their house was built with slave labor, and they'll kind of take the bait and they'll get in front of cameras. It's like, was it slave labor? It was just prison labor. It's like, well, you made prisoners build your house without paying them. They were forced to do hard labor without compensation. It's like, oh, I get it. I get it. We really do have a modern, slavery system going on here with the prison system. And that's obviously not me telling you what to think about our society. We live in one, man, but just the very end of this poem kind of forces you to consider that, at least to this narrator. There is a pretty direct correlation between prisoners and slaves, including how they're treated, including the race-based disparity between them. All right. So Hades welcomes his bride is something kind of completely different here. Hopefully y'all are still seeing my same screen here. All right. So this is another one that doesn't really have much in the way of like rhyming or traditional meter or anything, but it does have an interesting kind of conceit behind it. So this is obviously based on Greek mythology. So it's, Hades welcomes his bride. So Hades is like the lord of the underworld. And despite how he was portrayed in that Disney, Hercules movie, the Greek mythological Hades is not like a satanic figure or a bad guy. But he is, Lord of the Underworld, and, which is a place that the average human doesn't really want to spend a lot of time. And due to some Greek mythological shenanigans, there's a thing where, like, for one season out of the year, Persephone spends a season in Hades. Hades being the name of the place and also the person running the place, a little confusing. But Persephone spends a season in Hades, where she is supposed to be the bride to the titular, to Hades. All right. And so the whole poem has this interesting conceit where basically it's, he's showing her around her new home, their new home. And he's not an evil or malicious person, but he doesn't really understand the mind and motivation of, say, living people, right? So there's lots of I guess if you got a weird sense of humor, lots of weird humor, but otherwise stuff that's meant to be kind of spooky, kind of icky, where he's guiding her around. It's too dark for her to see much of anything, and then he'll throw out these lines like, "The pale things twisting overhead are mostly roots, although some worms arrive here clinging to their dead." So, just the Hades is just another day. Like, of course, there's weird worms on corpses, in this underworld, but it's something that would squig out, the average human being. And we never get any actual dialogue from Persephone. We just get like Hades' reactions to what she is saying or doing. So there's a bit where he's saying that like, oh yeah, here's going to be our thrones, my dear. And then he says, "No smile? Well, some solemnity befits a queen." So there's like a reflexive, oh, why isn't she smiling? And then it's like, yeah, she's going to be the queen of the underworld. She wants to have her game face on for that. All right. So there's lots of stuff here. Again, lots of stuff that he thinks she'll like that she probably won't like. He contrasts the golden throne that she's expecting with a throne made of deep black diamonds and lead. I was like, okay, diamonds are valuable, but it sounds like it's just a weird dark chair, and she was expecting perhaps the kind of golden throne she might have sat on in the surface world. And there's more stuff here where he talks about how he basically made her some friends, possibly literally. These things sound like ghosts. It says, "For you I chose those 3 thin shadows there, and they shall be your friends and loyal maids, and do not fear from them such gossiping as servants usually are wont. They have not mouth nor eyes, and cannot thus speak ill of you." So again, like him trying to be nice, but not really knowing what a human would be into or not be into. So, Hades is basically telling her here, it's like, I know you need friends and you're probably worried about people gossiping behind your back. Don't worry. I got you some friends that can't see anything or say anything. It's like, well, okay, no offense to any friends you have that might be in that situation, but that's normally not the first quality somebody would be looking for, right, when it comes to making new friends. All right, so we have these last 2 great bits here where he says that he's showing like basically the equivalent of the master bedroom, and it's like, I had the ceiling painted to recall some evening sky, but without the garish stars and lurid moon. So once again, Hades just doesn't know what makes us tick. So it's like he knows enough to know that humans like to look at the night sky, that we find it beautiful. And then though he's like, we painted the ceiling to look like the night sky, but don't worry, I took out all the stars and the moonlight. Well, what is a night sky if you take out all the stars? I mean, it's just pure black, right? So again, it's like he thinks that he's got this place just wired like it's exactly what she wants, what do you call it? What she'd want to see. And in reality, it's just making the place sound more and more unpleasant. And then we get to what is kind of like a twist ending almost. Well, not a twist, just a funny thing. So what? That stark shape crouching in the corner? Sweet, that is to be our bed. Our bed. And I was telling the class earlier, this is one of the few times that the poem decides to just leave everything to your imagination. Like instead of giving us a weird description of what the bed looks like, instead we get him reacting presumably to what she said. That stark shape crouching in the corner. Oh, that's our bed. So your mind can only speculate like, okay, what does it look like then? Like she did not clock that thing as a bed at all. Just how weird did it look? And we've got this last bit in here, kind of a tag ending. Your hand is trembling. I fear there is as yet too much pulse in it. So there is this idea, right, where it's like, okay, maybe you'll appreciate this a little more when you're kind of half dead yourself. And I mean, that might very well be the case. We can only assume Persephone, this is less onerous to her, after the first day, after the first week or first month or first season that she does this, because it's every year, one season out of the year. But at the same time, it almost comes off like an implied threat, right? Like, don't worry, you'll like this all more when you're somewhat dead. It's like, oh, okay, a little creepy to think about. All right. So wanted to move to something. This is a little more traditional, I guess, in every sense of the word. So you've got William Wordsworth, born in the 18th century, did a lot of his publishing in the 19th century, right? And if you've been waiting for a poem to show up and like look and sound like a quote unquote traditional poem, here you go. So it's exactly 12 lines. It's got the A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F rhyme scheme. It's got a very specific meter to it. Like you'll pick up the meter if you start reading this out loud, whether you mean to or not. She dwelt among the untrodden ways beside the springs of Dove, a maid whom there were none to praise and very few to love, a violet by a mossy stone half hidden from the eye, fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky. She lived unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be. But she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. So this is a very beautiful poem, but it's also so short, and there's not a whole lot to say about it. You know, he's using fancy rhymes and fancy words to describe kind of a sad but probably everyday situation where someone died. Not enough people, you know, knew the person, so she died, you know, really unknown, largely unmourned. But the narrator here is struck by the idea that, like, now that she's no longer here, he's really feeling some kind of way. You know, she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me. So I was telling the class earlier, your mileage may vary, but sometimes things like the poetry, it can be a little weird to understand, maybe sometimes a lot weird to understand. And so it's good. I think it's a good practice to focus on the things that, like, hey, that's relatable. That sounds like something I would do, or that sounds like someone I know. So you might or might not like the kind of sing-songy 19th century rhyming of this particular poem, but there is that very human moment, like, oh, I didn't know how much she meant to me until she was gone. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, everyone has had that feeling. Everyone has, you know, put up with something like that, encountered that kind of feeling. Hmm. But yeah, and it's one of those, it kind of, I like this poem. Like, I don't know if this was Wordsworth's main goal, I kind of doubt it, but once he spells out for you at the end that, oh, Lucy's dead, you know, she is in her grave, it kind of forces you to go back and, you know, like, okay, who's he talking about? Lucy. She dwelt among the untrodden ways. So, like, trod is when you walk on something. So an untrodden thing is something like she's basically going her own path. You know, she's a maid, but, you know, there were none to praise her. You know, there were few to love her. He seems to be talking about her not even having kind of like a substandard grave, a violet by a mossy stone, half hidden from the eye, fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky. So it's almost like damning with faint praise, right? Like the grave's in the middle of nowhere. It's tough to see. It might look as pretty as a star if there's only one star in the sky that night. So yeah, that's pretty much it. It's a poem about love, maybe grief, you know, not appreciating someone until they're gone, not realizing how much they meant to you until they're gone. So all of this very, very human, very relatable. All right. So probably gonna look at a couple more. Like, there's some poems that aren't gonna make the cut, but like I said earlier in the video, if you definitely want to write about one of these guys that we don't cover in the video, please just feel free to reach out. Like, I can whip you up some custom stuff to help with your understanding. You know, I can email some stuff, text some stuff, talk about it with you on the phone or video chat, just whatever works for you. All right. So, Song of Myself by Walt Whitman. All right. First, I want to give you the disclaimer. We are not going to read the whole thing. The reason I'm giving you that disclaimer is that this is a really long, it's basically a book of poems, right? You know, if you consider these numbered sections like stanzas, it's like 52 stanzas or 52 sections. It's a lot. We're not looking at all that. We're going to look at the first part and then one other thing later. All right. So what should you know about Walt Whitman? Walt Whitman, obviously, he's an American writer, but what is interesting is he wasn't doing that at a young age, which he's got a line in here. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. Instead, he heard the American writer, thinker, philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson say that, like, hey, we need a new kind of American writer, right? And, you know, and the reason for that, it's going to sound like a no-duh thing as I say it out loud, but, you know, imagine you've got a writer, pre-Revolutionary War, he's a British writer. Post-Revolutionary War, he's an American writer, technically. But this American writer, shocking nobody, still sounds a lot like a British writer. And so Emerson was big that, like, we needed some kind of new art. You know, we needed uniquely American writing created by uniquely American writers. And Walt Whitman heard Ralph Waldo Emerson saying that and said, all right, I'm it, baby. I'm the poet you've been looking for. Like, actually reached out to him, and he began a relatively late in life, you know, poetry career here. All right, so let's look at this first section. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air. Born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, suffice to what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature without check, with original energy. All right, what the hell is going on here? All right, so one of the things that, compared to a lot of the writers you probably, read, both just in our class and in general, Whitman is kind of whimsical, kind of laid back. So he's got some stuff here. I loaf and invite my soul. And I've had a student just point blank ask me today, like, what does loaf mean? I was like, well, loafing is like sitting around, not doing anything, being lazy, vibing out, you might say. And so normally there's a traditional school of thought where it's like, hey, if you want to kind of explore your soul, enrich your soul, like you got to be doing some kind of work. Maybe it's literal labor, maybe it's spiritual labor, emotional labor, yada, yada, yada. And here's Walt Whitman coming in like a wrecking ball, like, I loaf and invite my soul. Like, I'm going to do jack shit, and it's going to lead me to a new understanding of myself, a profound understanding of myself. And so I like that bit. I gave you that Emerson context earlier, so I was hoping you could appreciate this bit. It's like, I, now 37 years old, in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease not till death. So traditionally, right, we imagine writing, kind of like drawing, as something that somebody does at a young age, and they just cultivate that skill over and over and over. So here's Whitman, like, I've never really done this before, and I'm pushing 40, which, guys, 19th century, this was like beyond middle age at this point. It's like, oh, I got it. I'm going to do this. So this whole idea of becoming a writer really energized Whitman, and he became kind of the OG, like, it's never too late to follow your dreams, blah, blah, blah. All right. I did want you to look at this last bit because we have several confusing things right there together. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed it what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature without check, with original energy. All right, so what the hell's going on there? Abeyance is just a fancy word for like putting something on pause, suspending it, something like that, right? So creeds and schools in abeyance. Y'all as college students might be amused by this, but he seems to be saying that, like, hey, let's put a pause on what you're learning in school and in church. Schools like a traditional school, but also creeds, like where you find a religious creed. It's like, let's put all that on pause, and we're going to explore ourselves in our own terms, which feels very modern, right? The idea that, like, modernism, the idea that, someone doesn't necessarily need, a big library of books, or they don't necessarily need, a certain belief system in order to explore who they are. It's like, no, that's what Whitman's doing right now. He's showing us how to do it. I harbor for good or bad. I permit to speak at every hazard. Nature without check, with original energy. So this seems to be Whitman, sounding a little bit like a canceled comedian. I'm going to say what I have to say. But, in all seriousness, I harbor for good or bad. Like, hey, I'm going to speak up. I permit to speak at every hazard. It's like, hey, I'm going to be the one talking, just so you know. And then nature without check, with original energy. So you can maybe put the without check part and connect to that to the creeds and schools in abeyance. So it's like, what is going to temper human nature? What is going to maybe keep human nature from running rampant? It's going to be, what you're taught, like what to do and not to do, your actual school instruction, but of course also spiritual instruction, the idea of a young churchgoer. You can't do that. You can't say that. And so Whitman is telling you what he, and by extension his work, is all about at this point. Nature without check, with original energy. All right. So there's one other section I wanted you to see on this. I don't know if this section made it into your book, but it's I was telling the class earlier, this is probably my favorite line in literature. So he's in the middle of his weird, like he's close to the end now. You know, this is, I told you how there's 52 sections in this poem. This is in section 51 of 52, where, and it's like, do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I'm large, I contain multitudes. So there is this idea, at least I think, where he's saying there's a couple things going on, at least a couple things. All right. One of them, as you may or may not know, Walt Whitman was a big boy in his time. He was considered fat and he knew it. And so there's a little bit of kind of winking, humor here where it's like, I'm large, I contain multitudes. It's like, I'm a big enough boy, you can fit some contradictions inside me. But he also seems to be talking about humans and human nature in general, right? Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I'm large, I contain multitudes. So again, the idea that he's more interested in human nature than just like logical statements or whatever. So the idea that, it's probably been directed at you or you may have directed at someone else, but if you ever heard like, that doesn't make sense, I don't know why he's doing that, it's irrational, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, every human is large enough to contain multitudes. Everyone has the potential for contradictions within them. All right. Moving on to what will probably be our last one today. Let's see if I can pull this up. All right. So, Googling Emerson. So this was originally published in the New Yorker. What I'm afraid of is that we'll get some pop up as soon as we go in there. So give me just a second. I want the cached copy. There we go. All right. So I blame it on the book and who they chose to put in the book. But as with the fiction section, you've probably noticed that a lot of our authors are very, very old and very, very dead, right? Lots of poems from like the 19th century and some of them earlier in some cases. So here's an example. This was published in 2017. So on a sliding scale, not nearly as long ago as the other stuff. And it's a quirky poem. It's a little humorous, and then it gets kind of serious and sad. But basically, the narrator is somebody that is constantly Googling for his own name, and he's amazed at all the different people that seem to share his name, saying that, hey, he's got the same name as a cross-dressing exterminator rapist. He's got the same name as a guy just sentenced to 72 years. Oh, well, that's the same guy. I'm sorry. He's got the same name as a policeman killed stopping a burglary. He's got the same name as a Florida painter who communicates with extraterrestrials through sculptures made out of railroad tracks, right? So all these strange people, and they have nothing in common except they all have the same name, right? And so he's looking this kind of stuff up. It almost sounds like compulsive behavior. But in the second section, it starts getting kind of philosophical, kind of sad, maybe. Like, sometimes I fear I'm imaginary. I don't really exist. Catch myself wondering why I only seem to like myself when, say, I'm wearing a teacher's face, because I see myself only through others' eyes. In that case, who am I really? And just this idea that he's having like an existential crisis on like, I can't recognize myself except through others. And he's starting to realize maybe that ties into why he's looking at these other people that share his name. And it has a bit at the end talking about late at night, the web is a dangerous swamp of voyeuristic self-scrutiny and addictive impersonation. It's like the ego testifying for and against itself, seeking evidence of triumph and complicity, sanction without malice, pretext, or God. And so we get a last sad little bit on why he might Google himself outside of just vanity or whatever. Says, who is this man obsessively looking up all his persona narrators, feeling like a hodgepodge trapped somewhere between heaven and earth, spitting against the wind? All right, so that's him, right? And I love the idea that to him, these aren't just other people with the same name. These are people that are helping him navigate and narrate his own persona. Like he told us earlier that he only can see himself through the eyes of others. Now he kind of wants to see himself through all these other people that have the same name. And then here at the end, he's like, why am I doing this? This is just going to get older. And the last bit of the poem Is this why he's studying everyone who answers to his name? Because one may have invented time or sympathy or God and will love him even momentarily for who he is. So the idea that, his search for other people with the same name is also a search for greater meaning, right? A search for revelation, a search for greater understanding in his own life. All right. So if you guys need greater understanding, could be of the poems or whatever, feel free to email me. Feel free to text me at 863-835-2399. Y'all have a good one. Bye.